Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday Conversation with Friends. Today, I have a very special friend, Zsolt Bognar. And Zsolt, teach us how to say your first name properly.
It's Zsolt, which I can say is like the S in pleasure, which
There you
sounds maybe a little bit wrong, but it's one of the few sounds in American English that we can connect to this ZS combination in
You know
Hungarian.
what I love is the fact that we start off by being a little bit wrong because then we know this is going to be a fun and fantastic conversation. This is fantastic. I love it. And so, Zsolt, what is the heritage of your name? It's unusual, it's wonderful, it's beautiful. I love it. And tell us a little bit about your heritage because it just seems to be so interesting.
Well, first of all, Shirley, I wanted to thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here and to
Oh,
speak with you. And I've admired what you've been doing, especially adapting during this period. Something
and
that
you
I've tried
too.
to do, something that I've tried to do, but it's not the easiest thing. Where really the way of reaching people these days is through an
Mhm.
online method. But of
Right.
course, there comes a saturation point, so we have to make sure that our content is good. And I've loved everything that you've done.
Thank
So,
you. And I loved yours even before the pandemic. It was always been so interesting. It's wonderful for me as a musician to see two truly musical people interact with each other because to me, the interaction is much more natural and very authentic. So thank you for doing what you do.
well, thanks for that feedback because we try our best to convey what we feel passionate about, but
Mhm.
I never really know how I come across, and I know that I'm not for everyone, and not necessarily everyone would understand me, especially just because, as we're about to talk about my background, mine is
Mm.
quite unusual. So maybe people don't always know how to categorize me if that's important to them. But um, I was born in Urbana, Illinois, to multicultural parents. My father was born in Budapest, in Hungary.
Mm.
Um, so I spent a lot of my childhood summers there.
Wow.
I grew up speaking Hungarian in my home
I
in
love it.
in my little university town in Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. Um, and my mom is from the Philippines. She was born in Manila, but it seems that all of her ancestors were Chinese. And we didn't actually know this until recently, which is an amazing thing because here in America we keep records of everything. But for example, it was not an uncommon thing that, for example, my mom's younger brother didn't have a birth certificate. So we didn't know what his birthday was, so we made one up.
Right.
So these cultural exchanges, well, my mom and dad met in Japan. They met in Tokyo,
Wow.
and they were both studying there in school. And I was born in Illinois, so I mean, I don't look like uh, someone who would be born in sort of rural Midwest, but well, I don't know. People might take issue with that. It was a cosmopolitan community university town,
Right.
and there I grew up, and I talk too much, just like any good Illinoisan.
Oh, I love it. You make my job so easy.
Well, it's funny because the way people from the Midwest tell stories, everything is an anecdote.
I
So
love that.
you know, I when I was a kid, I used to deliver newspapers, and this was to support my habit of buying CDs, one a week.
I
Uh,
know,
that,
right?
that was my education as a kid. We had no YouTube, we had no Spotify.
Right. You had to buy the music you want to hear. And you didn't get to sample it first. You have to buy to know what it sounds like.
I was recently in Boston. I was visiting the high school where I went. There was a
Nice.
Walnut Hill School, and that's in Natick. And I took a little nostalgic walk through the town and found that there was an actual record store there with classical records and all the other types of music, of course, but they had records and CDs and even cassette tapes. And I walked in, I
Wow.
said, the last time I had seen anything like this was really in Boston in the late 90s when I was going to school there. And I said, I really feel like when I wanted my nostalgic walk through this town, I really got it. Like I am back there, you know.
Well,
So
you know, one thing about you, it just seems like you almost like you're from a different era than where you're born into. And I love that personally. I think it's so charming and so wonderful. And I'm just a little curious about how do you feel living in this world and which seems to be a little different than what you naturally gravitate towards.
Well, that's an amazing question. And I actually got goosebumps when you asked that because
Oh.
I've never had anyone ask me that. I have always somewhat, uh, I've been thinking about this a lot as to we're born in a certain time. And of course, there are so many reasons why I feel lucky to be born during this time of, say, modern medicine,
Hmm.
especially with what we went through with COVID and the vaccine. But recently, I was talking to my teacher, Sergei Babayan, and he was describing a teacher of his. And this teacher was Georgy Sarajev, a name that no one would know, especially in the West. But Sergei recently dedicated his most recent release of the Rachmaninoff album to Georgy Sarajev. And Sarajev was a pupil of Sofronitsky. So we're talking like the old legends of the Russian piano school.
Hmm.
And the one thing he talked about with this teacher, Sarajev, is that he seemed to be from a different era. And
Mm.
he, as a child, studying with Sarajev, was mesmerized by this. He says,
Wow.
I wanted to be like that too, where he had this old world genteel manners and this
Mhm.
kind of cultivated upbringing who he knew stuff and he took great care. I don't think that all of those values are necessarily not of this time, but I was mesmerized when he told me this story. And I somewhat never feel entirely like I fit into today's world. Um, I'm always, despite the ad nauseum posts that I'm making, on a daily basis on social media, I'm still really uneasy with it.
I
I
get it. I relate to that 100%.
like we don't really want to, but we feel like we have to
Right.
put ourselves out there, partially to be noticed. But for example, a lot of my work, living the classical life, it's an online format
Right.
primarily. And so how else do I get word out about it other than posting it
Right.
on social media?
Tell us, how do we find your episodes? Because I know there are two formats now versus one before the pandemic.
That's right. So with the formal film series, which has a full production crew,
Hmm.
usually films in New York City, there are two places that you can find this. So one is on our YouTube channel. You can just punch in Living the Classical Life, and we have, at the time that you and I are speaking right now,
Hmm.
there are about 83, 84 different episodes. We've filmed about 90, and we're hoping that there will be many more to come. You can also visit livingtheclassicallife.com, where you
Hmm.
can find this in Vimeo format, which some people prefer that. They think it's a more elegant interface, but I think it's very similar. Um, what I've done recently during the pandemics, obviously I've not been able to film with a crew and have people in person. So I've tried to do some virtual conversations,
Right.
these
Right.
live chats through Instagram.
Hmm.
There are a lot of limitations to that format, but
Yes.
it's a nice way to have some interaction. And
Right.
the cool thing about it is that some of the fans who are tuned in, they've really loved the chance to be there in
Interact.
and to ask questions.
Right.
And it's funny because for me, I've led some of these conversations. And I said, I don't know if that was any good or if that was interesting. I was like, would anyone tune into that? Um, Especially for what I say.
Hmm.
And then I get these letters from people saying, thank you so much for doing that. That was so interesting. And I'm like,
Hmm.
really?
Right. So how did you get into this at first place? Because I know you're also a writer. Let's back up a little moment. Let's talk about who you are before we get into why you got into this. You are a pianist, and I've of course there's information online about you which is helpful for me. That I know you love Schubert, you love Schumann, and big part of it is because you fell in love with vocal music, and Cecilia Bartoli was somebody you just really you loved, but who are you, and what are your identities in this world, and how did you get into this online format, this show that you started hosting, and what are you doing nowadays besides that?
Well, surely that's a really interesting question because these are things that I think about on so many different levels, whether musically or personally. I
Hmm.
I think I'm still sorting this out.
Hmm.
For us as musicians, you as a singer, I'm sure that there are so many aspects of finding literally or figuratively your own voice.
Right.
I mean, we're pushing the keys and making an inanimate object sing.
Hmm.
As for my identity, I think my unusual life keeps people guessing because
Right?
I
It's
don't
like,
know.
who is he? Whose
I
name
don't.
starts with the sound of pleasure, right?
Exactly. Um, yeah, I grew up studying piano, and this was the center of my every dream as a kid. I grew up when I was buying those CDs each week. I was collecting recordings of Van Cliburn,
Ah,
Horowitz, Ashkenazi.
right,
These were the ones who were readily available, at least at
right.
before I became like a really hardcore collector.
Mm,
And I looked at that and I said, "Oh, that seems like a magical life where you go around the world and you share your music." Little did I realize that that particular lifestyle doesn't necessarily exist in that way anymore. I mean,
mhm.
that was a generation of pianists who benefited from basically the Steinway Company. They were walking
Right.
billboards for the Steinway
They
Company.
were. I remember when Horowitz was, I think he met Rachmaninoff in the Steinway Gallery in New York, in the basement, right?
The basement,
And
which I remember that old Steinway Hall. It was right near
yeah,
Carnegie Hall, and the
yes.
lobby was a slice of 19th century New York, which is a little bit elusive. But for example, both of them, Horowitz and Rachmaninoff, they were both part of the A-listers of the Steinway
Hmm.
Company, which that
Right,
included both Rubinstein's Anton and Arthur. That
right.
that included Joseph Hoffman and Paderewski. So these
Hmm.
pianists could basically go anywhere they wanted to, so long as they played the Steinway and
Steinway
they
piano.
Steinway have the big, big. I mean,
On the side of the body of the consagrant, Steinway and Sons, right?
but today that is about this size. Back then, it was actually enormous. Like, there's no way to know
Billboard.
what the brand is. so so they could do that, and back then people were buying. Every American household aspired to have a piano. It,
Right, because this is even before the radio. And so this was a form of entertainment, and that's the reason why we have those paper rolls, those piano rolls for the for piano players, because they could record those famous pianists. They have remember that recording of Gershwin that was recorded on the music roll on the roll, and the people could play that in their living room, and so that was piano was the thing to have.
it was like
Yeah.
having Gershwin there in the room. The pianos that were really well calibrated in those days, and it's hard to find such pianos, the reproducing pianos, it really felt like before the digital era, it was like having that famous artist in your own living room.
Hmm.
Added the fact that these pianos were also kind of a status symbol,
That's
and
right.
people wanted to say, "Oh, look, we can have a piano," which was kind
Hmm.
of fun, and it has a cool shape and everything. As for me, I was mesmerized by all aspects of the piano, including the shape. So, for example, Stravinsky was always saying when he's trying to compose for the piano, he started by looking at the piano. He says the shape of it just inspired him, and then the ideas started to come to him for his piano compositions. I mean, isn't that kind of cool?
Wow. Well, of course, we hear about the story of Chopin and the raindrop prelude. He was really driven crazy by the raindrops where he was staying, right? And I noticed some of your postings in also some groups where you talked about you also collect different editions of the scores.
Yes, and this didn't I didn't even realize that this was something worth doing until I got a little bit older and realized it started out by comparing different recordings of different pianists. I said, how could they sound so different? And in some
Hmm.
cases, they're playing completely different notes. I said, "Uh-oh, are they misreading?" And I said, "Okay, well, Schnabel has his own edition of the Beethoven sonatas. Okay, let's have a look at those." And I said, "Well, is that really so different from the Henley edition?" And I said, "Well, yes, it is
Hmm.
very different. How could that be?" So I would compare, and I would try to get closer to whatever the composer originally did. And the cool thing about the internet now, and sometimes on IMSLP,
Yes,
you
yes,
can find
my
a man.
favorite friend. Right.
Exactly. Sometimes it helps so much financially, right?
Yes.
Um, so there that was this comparing the scores that can be helpful. I recently had the discussion with a friend of mine. We were comparing pianists, and I won't mention their names because they're alive, but we compared two different performances of the Davidsbündler of Schumann, which is a
Mm,
musical I adore and only recently came to sort of understand how amazing it is. But one pianist seemed to be all about the poetry and rising above the score. And then the other pianist seemed to be a slave of the score. Everything was correct. Absolutely everything was correct. And yet it didn't seem to rise above it. And I'm sure if you and I could go back to the day, and wouldn't that be amazing if we could meet
You know,
Schumann and
it's so
hear him and
true.
Clara make music? I'm sure that both of them would tell us either in words or through their performances that the score is just the starting point.
You know, I got to share this wonderful thing I've experienced during the pandemic. During the pandemic, everybody's so much more open to connecting with people they don't know but share things in common, particularly in music. So I've connected with some living composers, and one was a young man who wrote a collection of piano solos. So when I played it, I sent it to him. So what do you think? And he said, "I love the way you played, even though it's not the way I heard it. He loves the way it comes to life." And then yesterday, I had a wonderful Zoom call because there's a composer, a female composer, and she writes a lot of educational music for young pianists. But she recently has one of her advanced piano solo piece published, and I loved it. And it sounds nothing like the rest of her stuff my students play. And so I asked her, "Have you written anything for a lyric soprano?" And she did. And she sent me a song cycle. And we had a wonderful Zoom call yesterday going through the pieces and her original intentions. And what's really interesting to me is, and I've not really done any music like this, is she wrote a poem to the music as well. It's a collection of 8 songs about her experiences of visiting Lake Superior. And she wrote. She's a pianist, so the way she wrote was very pianistic, and so you know, it's been a pleasure to be able to speak to the composer directly, and because it's like what you said, I spent my whole life wondering what would the composer say about all those different practices, all those different interpretations, and you know, I think a lot of those composers that you and I are so enamored with, I don't think they had a lot of opportunities to hear people playing their pieces who are professionals. Because, you know, of course, they want to sell as many copies as they could when they were alive to the people to play in their living rooms. And, but all those great pianists of, the past 100 years who made recordings.
Yes, and then the other thing that we have to keep in mind is sometimes these composers can change their minds.
Yes.
For example, I was listening the other day to a lot of recordings of Rachmaninoff playing his own music, and I was looking at this. He's disregarding everything he wrote.
Right.
Descriptions of Beethoven playing by his friends said the same thing. They said, "Wow, he made these wild rubatos, changed the time and the tempos, and put oceans of pedal whereas the score was very specific, and professors do this kind of thing these days, and they say wrong." Again, so the score can just be a departure point. But I think it was Stephen Huff who, and I apologize if I'm misattributing this, but he pointed out that if we have performed a particular work, say a Beethoven sonata, across different periods of our lives, we have had a longer working relationship with this score than the composer did.
That's so true.
Isn't that something?
Oh my gosh, I never thought about that.
Yeah, because they wrote it, and composers like Beethoven and Mozart, they
They
had
moved
for
on.
their lives. They composed it, then they set it aside, and they went on to their next works.
Right.
They didn't slave over it like we do, like I have to in order to get halfway decent if I ever get there. But yeah, the examining of the scores has been a fascinating process. And of course, back to your original question, how do I categorize myself? Sometimes I feel like I have to be careful because I have so many interests in life, and I don't want to sort of diffuse whatever abilities I might have that have to be honed in. But because being a pianist, that's a 25 hours a day pursuit.
Yes, it
Try
is.
to do things good and to expand your repertoire. The living the classical life, me as a host, I mean, to me that's that makes me laugh because I grew up as a really shy kid. I, when I was 6 or 7, they were trying to assess, what grade to put me in, just to, where should we start in school. They couldn't assess this because I wouldn't say anything. I wouldn't say any words, or I would start crying. But
Oh,
yeah, usually
oh.
the crying part. So me hosting a show, I never thought that was an accidental thing. So a few friends and I were trying to establish a website for me because I didn't have one, and it seemed everyone had to have one, right? Because
You know what? I've lived for a long time before the pandemic without, I still don't have a performer's website because I don't really know what to do with it.
I don't think people really do much with websites anymore. At the central gathering point seems to be Facebook. People will just look there, but
Right.
even Facebook now seems to be kind of. I recently tuned into a live stream on Instagram of two young people, and it was unrelated to music. And the subject of Facebook came up, and they said, "Facebook? Who uses Facebook? That's for old people." And I'm like,
It's like, why do people make phone calls?
exactly. No one leaves, a voicemail.
Voicemails. Right. So why are you bothering me by calling me? It's
Yeah,
like people are texting each other from two sides of the rooms. You
yeah.
know?
They say, "Don't bother me with a voicemail. Text me." Yeah. So the evolution of the website. I remember I played a recital in Palm Springs, and I
Mhm.
just played this recital, and there was an old woman who came backstage, and she asked me, "Do you have a website?" And I said, "Well, at that point, yes, I did have one." And she says, "Oh, well, then you must be good." And I said,
I know.
"But you just heard me play. Shouldn't that decide if I was terrible or not?" No, for her, if I had a website, then that was impressive. So I
Well,
had
I'm from California, so I get to say it. That's California for you. You have to be famous to be good. If you have a web presence, then you are famous.
Well, that's of course the perception these days, and that brings us back to the question of how comfortable we feel with social media as a way to connect with people. It's a love-hate relationship for me
Yeah, I
as a
relate to
way
that.
to connect with the widest possible audience. But it is very self-serving, and it can look. I mean, there's a fine line between getting your work out there and being narcissistic,
Mhm. Yeah.
which sometimes it's hard to tell which is which.
The line is so thin, and I think for people who are immensely private, it's very interesting that we could be sharing things that appear to be incredibly personal, but it is very manicured.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, when are we being completely ourselves? And that's been sort of a theme of our conversation.
Right.
Who am I? How do I categorize myself? So, as a result of this show, which I'm very grateful, has been a way for me to connect with many, many people around the world, and many of the personalities that I grew up admiring, and then many really meaningful people who have connected
Hmm.
with the content. Um, at the same time, it still feels like each time I'm in front of the camera, I'm like, why is it me who's in front of this camera? All I am is this guy from Illinois who talks so much and is
Maybe that is exactly why. Because you are a guy from Illinois who is open to talking, and that may make you so. I think we can relate to you. We can relate to you, and you seem to also have a superpower, but yet we can relate to you. I think that's why we really enjoy watching you interacting because a lot of your guests, many of your guests are legends, and but most of the time when they're interviewed by somebody who is not necessarily a musician, someone may have a musical background but is not necessarily a performer like yourself. So it's always been really wonderful to see you connecting. I do remember at one point in my 20s when I was studying, one of my mentors and William Januzzi, and he was the music director for Baltimore Opera for 30 some years until the day he dropped dead in the opera company. He said, at some point, Shirley, you have to begin to realize there is no difference between you and the greats. So what are you going to do to become as good as they are?
I that's so interesting that you should say that because I was watching an interview of someone I would have loved to have had on the show, but I was too late. Dmitry Forostovsky.
Oh my goodness, yes. I was in New York and watching a dress rehearsal for Verdi's Requiem at the Met the day after he passed away, and they dedicated that particular performance because those dress rehearsals are really public performances to him. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Absolutely. So I had no idea. I had grown up hearing his Met broadcasts over the radio. Back in those days, it was radio at first. Um, and his incredible recordings. I didn't know what kind of person he was, so I saw this online chat series, and there he was, very very informal, and he talked about in high school he was collecting all these recordings of the great singers he admired, and at that time he said to himself, well, why can't I do that? If they can do it, I can. So I'm just going to try to be that good. So that was his starting point. And this immersion of being around people you admire. I mean,
Yeah.
that has been really one of the lucky things about my show. All I do is just ask the questions that I was curious about. How did they
Right.
get there? How did they overcome all the doubts that they had? And most of them had the same doubts that I had. So
Right.
that was really refreshing. But then my musical identity doesn't stop there. I run a concert series south of Cleveland in Hudson, Ohio, and this is a
Oh.
series that's in its 38th season. I mean, that also takes 25 hours a day.
Yes, it does. I know, because I helped. Oh my goodness, that is a lot of work. That is a lot of work, and managing musicians is a difficult job.
It's a difficult job on so many levels because you're
Hmm.
keeping so many people happy, whether it's
Right.
the public who you hope will come to the concerts, the
Mhm.
artists who you hope will feel valued and
That's right.
comfortable to give their best performance, and
And they're
then
managers.
they're managers, and then you have to interact with the donors, and then
Yes.
you have to interact with your board. So that's a whole separate
Oh
conversation
yes.
because it's running an arts nonprofit. Well, I didn't have training to do any of this in school. I would have loved to have, but I had to figure it all out on my
I
own.
almost think those are the things you learn on the fly, and I also think Uh, some people, and I have a feeling you are one of those people who have a special gifting in the personality, just navigates through those different personalities very well because that's almost the biggest part of the job is to have the kind of ability to adapt to a lot of different personalities and most of those personalities are very big and big in different ways, and so be able to be around them for them to see you as one of them, not somebody who's not just somebody who's there to serve them, but as one of them, while you can serve the interest of the organization is an art in itself.
I grew up as one of three boys, and so I was the middle child. So
Ah,
often it's said that the people who are children, they are kind of good at mediation and diplomacy because they're always between adversarial forces. Now, my brothers were lovely, but of course, there's the normal sibling kind of interaction. I do think that that had something to do with it.
ah,
Um, and I have to say that what you're saying is absolutely correct. A lot of the work that I do, in whatever capacity, is negotiation and diplomacy between people involved because there are a lot of personalities involved.
right,
And
right.
99% of it, in terms of resolving conflict, is communication.
Absolutely. It's helping people to see that their visions can benefit each other versus against each other. And it's not about winning and losing. It's about that that capital W and the the lowercase w can coexist, and that's an art in itself. That is a lot of different hats you wear, and I know you're also an author. You're also a writer.
When I was 9 or 10 years old, my father gave my brothers and myself little journals and said, you should write down your thoughts and your observations about the world and your life right now. One day you'll thank me. And that's how it started. And then through middle school and high school, I had a lot of great English teachers who really got my love of writing going. And I was a voracious reader too.
That makes a huge difference.
It makes a huge difference. But I think to tie this all back together, I think what this really came down to was I love a good story. I love to
Yes.
I love to tell a good story. I love to hear a good story, and I'm always trying to gather these things. I grew up as an NPR junkie, mostly
Oh
with
yeah.
I just wanted to hear people's life story, and
Right.
not just how successful they became, but what did you have to go through in your life, and how did you navigate that difficult thing? And then when they shared that thing, then I feel like there's so much that we can all connect over. And I think that really comes down to the. I know it sounds cheesy, but these are some of the essences of what we try to communicate as musicians. Not to impose that onto the music that we play, but as a tool that we try to use to understand what the composer had inhabited in their own world.
I think it's almost a requirement to truly bring this music to life with a certain depth. And it's interesting because I became a singer because I wanted to be close to the words, because I wanted to be close to the words, and I couldn't believe the depth and the colors the words can be expressed in so many different languages when I discovered vocal music. And I know at a very young age, you also were exposed to vocal music. And your CD was made of composers who wrote a lot of vocal music as well as piano music, Schubert and Schumann, right? And could you talk to us a little bit about your relationship with that? And I can we hear some of your playing?
Yes, absolutely. Well, on YouTube, it's almost deliberately almost nothing is there of my own playing, and that's just because I'm so shy and kind of scared of putting my work out there.
I Yes.
I usually don't think it's good enough.
That's
Uh,
the reason why you see me doing the tutorials for the student piano pieces, but so few of my vocal work, because it never feels like that should be the end of the road for those pieces.
Right, and don't get me wrong. This is not me being falsely modest. This is me just always never feeling satisfied with what I do. I mean, that extends from the practice room to the concert hall. If something is not so bad on occasion, I feel like that's accidental, and that has to do with the hard work that I try to do. But if you go online, you can find uh, there is this preview for that CD.
I saw that, yes, and you sound wonderful, and you may be, very modest, and I think it's false modesty because I love the way you play, and I also saw the I think it's a TED talk, a TED Med, or what's it called, and
Yes, and that's an offshoot of the TED brand. The TED Med is it's different from even the TEDx, which is I think
mhm,
a syndicated franchise that happens in different parts of
mhm.
the world. Um, but I was very lucky to be asked to give a talk there. Um, and I'm never sure because I'm asked to give more and more talks and performances. I'm never really fully sure why I'm being asked, whether it's for my playing or is it my talking or maybe a combination of both.
I think it has to be a combination of both. And Jolt, personally, I adore your playing. And I've actually listened to your entire album, and I loved it. It was beautiful. And as a lot of musicians, what we do is we stay up late at night. We think we're going to listen to one or two things. And then we put this on the loop, and then we forget to go to bed.
Well, thank you for saying that, and I always thank anyone who talks about me as being a pianist because that for most of my life everything was centered around that.
Right.
Was my big dream, continues to be really if I could work through all the issues I have with nerves on stage or just me liking my playing or not, I still very much think of myself as a pianist or someone who really delves in the world of all this great music that I love. So yeah, I think it's maybe a combination of those two things, and I'm grateful for that because the standard career that would be probably too stressful on my nerves. I don't think I could endure 120 concerts a year of playing the same pieces, or maybe that might get easier, rather than just giving one concert a year where it feels like all the pressure comes down to that one concert and it's a one-off and then you feel like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna die. maybe.
Thank you for being so honest about that feeling.
So that Russian pianist I mentioned before, Sofronitsky, who at his best could play like a god, and at other times it was just so difficult for him to be on stage. And there was a quote that I read that each performance seemed to him like an existential confrontation with the instrument. And I thought,
Oh my God.
that's amazing.
Wow.
Because I also had the other perspective, which was sometimes in Europe, there was one period that I'm thinking of where in 11 days I had 10 performances. Certain aspects are a little bit easier because from night to night you can sense where your baseline is, where you start to see how much you can.
Right, right, right.
When you establish that baseline, you say, okay, well, tonight I think I can really go for it here, but I can also pace my energy so that I don't run out of steam there. So that's helpful, but it's still difficult for me and still exhausting because I do give my everything to my performances.
Do. I've watched some of your and it's fascinating because you can tell it's a person with a somewhat reserved personality, and that's usually I've seen you begin a lot of some of the clips I've seen is how you began, and but then there's this incredible passion and focus, and of course your technique is wonderful, and it just it all comes together, but it's a lot of intensity, a lot of intensity, and it could be it in itself is exhilarating at the moment and very exhausting afterwards.
Well, yes, you have to sort of look out for your own adrenal health.
Who wants that? It doesn't matter, right?
Like I sometimes wonder. I look at my performances and I say, "Wow, that looks really manic." Hungarians tend to be so choleric, and everything is so extreme. But during this, about a month ago, I had a really interesting lesson, and this has to do exactly with what we all had to go through in the past year. The way to connect with people is through an online format. So this pianist, Maria João Pires, I hope I said that correctly, she started offering online lessons. And I said, oh my goodness,
Wow.
I love her playing and especially her Schubert. So I said, why don't I learn a new Schubert piece and play it for her and sign up for these lessons, which you can do. And so I learned a Schubert sonata, the last one, the B flat, which I always, coming back to what you were saying about singers and Schubert, I feel like all of his melodies were really derived from anything that a singer could do. It was all within that framework. Because you can look at melodies of Beethoven, for example, and you say, oh, the singer probably couldn't do that.
Well, and even his arias and his art songs would go, well, it's really okay. I just listen to his symphonies instead.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Or his Fidelio. There's so much there that is incredible music, but it's really unrealistic for the voice. But I played for Maria João Pires, and she had so many fascinating things to say. But one of them was on this subject of what you're talking about intensity. And she said, Joel, if we want to be expressive and bring the message of the music across, we have to ask ourselves, how much of this feeling do we give away to the audience, and how much of it do we keep for ourselves? And I said, whoa.
Right. So then what was your, because now it's been, you've had a little time to play with that idea. What has your journey been like playing with that idea, kicking it around in the way you work with that piece?
Sometimes we think of this even in terms of our own lives, because I consider myself a really open and transparent person. But sometimes, if we bring it back to music, by letting something unfold in layers, and I was extremely flattered that you perceived.
I certainly do, and I love it.
That you perceived a progression. I think sometimes for the listener, having everything given to them all the time could be overwhelming and could in fact detract from the maybe making a really focused point. So I think also her point was by dialing it back a little bit, sometimes the listener can fill in some of the blanks through their own experience. And I thought that was fantastic. That's just my projection and that's my conjecture, but I think Also, if I didn't put the pressure on myself that I'd always have to be 200% on stage, maybe it wouldn't have to be so difficult to always play.
But you know, that makes me think of two things. One is, who is our audience today? Well, I think this past year, as difficult as it has been for live art, performing arts, you know, live performances, I think this has been a year of great transitions. I think we have broadened potentially some of our audience bases, and by people being a lot more generous in giving away their performances, and because people needs to be exposed in order to have a chance to fall in love. It's like you can't fall in love with somebody you've never even heard of, and you need to somehow know this person is there, right? So the same thing with this type of music. So who is our audience today, and what touches them, and why?
I'll put it this way,
Mm-hmm.
because you made me think of um, on who is our audience, but
Uh-huh.
I'm also wondering on what level do we connect with our listeners? You
Right,
were
right.
asking earlier about my relationship and how singers inspired me. Years ago, here in Cleveland, I heard a Schubert recital. It was Ian Vostrich and Julius Drake, a pianist I intensely admire. And I remember this evening, it was in the small hall of Severance Hall, and it was just an evening of Schubert songs.
Mm.
And I remember at some point feeling tears going down, and then I just kind of secretly glanced at people. Everyone in my row, they were doing this. Then I looked behind me. There was a woman who was covering her face with her program book because she didn't want people to see that she was crying too.
Right.
And I just sort of thought to myself, okay, well, what is the audience perceiving here?
Mm.
I'm going to assume that most of them, or a lot of them, didn't speak German. Some of them were following along with the texts. Others were looking. So, are they connecting with the music? Are they connecting with the texts? The combination of those, how it's being presented to them, the music itself, sort of divorced from the understanding of the words. You can also be paying attention on that level, or it could also be something else entirely. It could be the vibe in the room. It could be the collective experience of being there in the audience. And that's one thing that we're excited to return to, hopefully.
Yes, yes, definitely. Right.
But I'm thinking of something that Christian Zimmerman, the pianist, said.
Mm-hmm.
He said that in a performance of what's communicated, he thinks that only 40% of it, even in a piano recital, only 40% of that is music. So you say, what is the rest of it?
Right.
The rest of the experience, what's going on, what's being communicated, what's being sensed.
Mm.
I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but I think that's one of the exciting things
Hmm.
about the world of performance. I think part of it is that it's in the moment.
Right. And I remember the second thing I was going to bring up is, you know, I do have a friend who's now in his 90s. He was a concert pianist who toured in Europe, and then he decided he just couldn't do it anymore, and so he quit and he went to medical school and became a doctor. And I also thought about somebody like Glenn Gould. And of course, I would joked with somebody else that, you know, he was the granddaddy of all those people who are live streaming online, right? And 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 he just really made a conscious decision of he stopped performing live and he just recorded, and it was a different pursuit of perfection, right? And he what are your thoughts on people's decisions like that? Because it's not a abandoning and departing from the music making, but it's an active choice in doing it differently.
That's a fantastic, brilliant question because I think that that goes to the heart of how we feel at our best. When I was speaking in the early days of living the classical life to the singer Nathan Gunn, he
Mm-hmm.
said, he said, make your art where you make your best art. So if that's on recordings, make recordings. If you feel like you make your best art in a house recital setting,
Mm-hmm.
sing lots of house recitals. If you flourish in a big hall, then aim to do that if you can. Um, I know a woman here, a very close friend of mine, uh, and I'll say her name, Raika Radivojevic, because I'll send this to her.
Okay.
Um, She heard Glenn Gould in concert
Mm.
in the early 60s in Toronto, which is, of course, where Glenn Gould lived his whole life. We think of this notion that musicians have to live,
In New
say,
York.
in the center, the New York or Berlin or Paris.
Mhm.
But he lived his whole life in Toronto and he flourished there. She said that she observed, listening from the second or third row, that she could actually see his hands quaking. He was that nervous. It was such suffering for him. And I thought, wow, okay, even on his level of talent and genius, that he experienced whatever it was that caused him to have that reaction,
Mm.
he found his way of reaching his audience was through the controlled setting of the studio. And of course, we know he really flourished in that way.
Right, right, right. Absolutely, absolutely. Yes. And wow, it's just been such a pleasure talking with you because it's a beautiful exchange. To me, it's an exchange of humanity. It's because to me, that's what music speaks is humanity. And whether it's live, whether it's recorded. And I think one of the things about the pandemic that I personally appreciate is I think when digital recording came about, music making became perfection driven. And but during the pandemic, it's allowed people to perform in a much more humanistic way again. And I think we need to speak more humanity. And I was having a conversation with another pianist, and he said when he judged competitions, he knew what kind of pianist was going to what they were going to win. And but there are also those who would do something with their music, and they weren't the ones who were going to win because they did something, they took a risk.
My piano teacher in recent years has been asked to judge more and more competitions. And one thing he says is that he can very quickly tell who is there to try to win something and who is there to try to share their love of music.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but you can kind of tell the difference pretty quickly on what level they're trying to engage.
Right, right. And it's interesting as a teacher, as an instructor, I'm able to help my students to make decisions, to enter into competitions and win them. And but it's another layer and level to help them to become inspired, and that little extra something, and it's a very interesting thing. And I think today we just cover so much about so many different things and so many different levels of humanity within music making. And we get to know you as a human being, which I think is a privilege because for all those episodes you've done, I always feel I can see a part of you coming through. It's always so authentic and so just so engaging and so honest. But at the same time, you're always so focused on the other person, which is so beautiful. And but today we got to see you. And it's such a privilege. And I just love and thank you for sharing who you are.
Well, Shirley, the pleasure was all mine, and I realized that this conversation, the time just flew by, and I ran the clock into the ground with all my endless blabber. But I have to say that the ideas that you've shared and what you put into a conversation are very inspiring to me, and have given me a lot of food for thought. So whereas I don't, and I've mentioned this to you, whereas I don't usually go back and listen to any conversations that involve myself, I will listen to this one again because you brought up points that I would have been taking notes on. So thank you so much for having me on your show for this conversation, and I really wanted to express my admiration for what you do and how you do it.
Oh, thank you. And likewise. And so we're going to say goodbye right now, but if you stay tuned, you're going to get to hear a solo Zsolt play at the end, and it's going to be from his album. And I hope you get to fall in love with his music as much as I have. So until next time, thank you, Zsolt.
Thank you, Shirley.